The Yog-Sothoth Astramon Antarte chant, that was something that I had created for the Cultists of Yog-Sothoth for the Journey to the Tree of Sorrows, so you can see that Mike here is really clued in on that. Of course, the rest of the chant is the classic lines from the Necronomicon that pertain to Yog-Sothoth. When I had envisioned this scene as we were writing it, of course we've got all this fog in here, which again I'm making with a fog machine on the other side of the bed. I had envisioned so many more sticks of incense in here, like he's got the room covered with them, which is what's creating all this fog, but we weren't really able to do that once we got in there, so we just have this kind of one stick of incense that he's got, and supposedly all of this fog that this one stick of incense is causing. So hopefully we get that point across with this. And now when Dad comes in and says, "You know better than to start these long and involved rituals," that was a line that my parents used to give to me regarding board games. Like, you know better than to start one of these long and involved board games that I used to like to play right before dinner. So I was a board gamer, but I suppose that applies if your kid is a cultist as well. And of course, with the idea of spell components, we're also kind of introducing a Dungeons & Dragons element as well that will come out later, and especially in Season 2. This shot here, where Mike is going to be having dinner with his parents, and particularly this shot where he's across the table from them with his hood up, was something that was conceived very early. We have at least a couple different scenes this season where they're eating dinner here at the table, and that's one of those things I didn't think about that's actually a bit more complicated to execute than you might think, and certainly that I thought about when writing it. You got to have the meal there. As it turns out, most of the time, the meals that we had on camera were what the crew was eating for lunch that day. We're also thinking about the relationship between Dad and Mike here. We've already started to set something up here in that previous interview shot with Dad that you saw, and Dad was actually one of those characters that we originally wanted to have, but then decided to cut, but then we decided to do auditions for anyway, and then when David Orange showed up and auditioned for Dad, we were like, we need to have Dad. And that's been a great idea from the storytelling perspective because I really like developing the relationship between Mike and his dad. He's kind of a secondary character in this season, but that goes through and really starts to blossom in Season 2. And now we introduce Rob, played spectacularly by Dax Rocker. This Rob introduction scene where Mom opens the door and there's Rob, that was also conceived very early. But you know, we didn't tell Dax to come in once Mom opens the door, so we just stood there. We had meant for him to come inside, but him just standing there was so good looking like Rob, that's the take that ended up making the cut at the door. And then we sit down for Rob's monologue. I remember this evening shooting this with Dax, and it was just amazing because Dax becomes Rob when he's on screen. And I love how he delivers this monologue. He is the character, and at some point, I don't know if it's on screen, but he's standing there staring at the character with his trident with the fish on his head, and this like moth or fly or something just flies across the screen, and he doesn't even notice. He's just so intense that he is Rob. It's so fantastic. And I really hope that the fans of the Cthulhu mythos and H.P. Lovecraft and all those stories appreciate all of the lore that goes into this, and this is one of those scenes where that lore comes out, with the esoteric order of Dagon and everything like that, and Rob hoping that he has Deep One ancestry and so forth.
Tonight, Rob and I are going to
What Rob is mumbling here about something about a whole school of necromantic fish as he comes down the stairs, that's one of my favorite things in this series. And here again, this being a night scene, this is one of those things you don't think about when you're writing the scripts, because this is our first time we've ever shot any kind of web series. Actually, shooting night scenes like this is complicated. We've got all kinds of lights that are actually in here that are illuminating this enough to actually see while still making it look like night. Turns out, night scenes are complicated. One of the things that I really like about this show is that when I was writing Journey to the Tree of Sorrows, I had so deeply immersed myself in the Lovecraftian stories. I got into them deep. I've got copies of them with highlights and notes all in the margins and everything like that, tons of notes. And so I hope that even though this is a comedy, that fans of the mythos realize that it was done with a lot of knowledge of the mythos and of the lore that comes out, even though this is comedy. This scene was shot in my backyard, and it was so cold the night that we shot this. I felt so sorry for everybody who was out there trying to shoot this scene, because we were also having all kinds of technical problems. My backyard is this big field, and we were trying to run power cables in order to bring lights down, because even though it's a night scene, we've got to bring lights down with power cables in order to run them, and that was taking a while, and there were technical difficulties there, and it was taking a long time, and we were so cold. The tombstone that you see in the scene is something that we created in my workshop, And after we shot this scene, I just left it in my backyard for a long time. I wanted to know how long it would last. We made it out of foam, and then it's got a rubberized coating on it and then acrylic paint, and I left it there for over a year. I didn't know if we were going to need it again, so I decided to leave it exactly like we left it after this scene in case we needed to come back in a future season, and just let it kind of sit there and become one with the environment. When my younger nephews would come over, I would take them into the backyard and I would show them that tombstone, and I would tell them that when I bought the house there was somebody buried in the backyard, and sometimes their family would come and come and leave flowers at their grave. So my nephews thought there was somebody actually buried in the backyard, but later I told them that wasn't true. But that tombstone actually stayed in the backyard for about 16 months until one day I finally saw that it had fallen over. I think it was the wooden supports that rotted and basically let it fall over. But I've still got the tombstone itself if we ever need it. I'm especially proud of this scene right here as a scholar of the Cthulhu mythos. If you are as well, you may recognize this incantation that Mike is saying, that it's actually a passage from an inhabitant of Carcosa, and that's a short story by Ambrose Bierce that was published in 1886. And that story has the first mention of the city of Carcosa, which of course then becomes later intertwined with the lore of the Yellow King, which is significant in the Cthulhu mythos, and then of course as well in this story that we're telling here. Now, we did go back and forth on what happens here because as the script was written, they did actually see the yellow sign and you were going to see that on camera, but that doesn't actually work because as this is shot in mockumentary style, you wouldn't actually see whatever it is they see because of whatever substances they are on. So we dropped that. And we do have one of our only special effects scenes, so to speak, because these candles do go out. And that might be suggestive that something is actually happening here that's not just in their minds, maybe. But then also this dialogue that they have, I forget exactly how it was written in the script, but it wasn't all that great. And so this idea about the 8th grade English teacher and Mrs. Cartlin, that was all made up by Dax and Peter as they were out there this night working on that. And then their great experiment with necromancy ends.